Saudi Arabia did shoot down 7 ballistic missiles, but if debris still fell near energy facilities in the eastern region, then the sky did not save the story. It only moved the danger one layer lower. From interception footage to the ground around the part of the kingdom, the world reads as oil, exports, and strategic nerve. Then came the line that should have frozen every serious viewer. Major General Turki al-Malki confirmed the 7 interceptions, confirmed debris in the vicinity of energy facilities, and said the damage assessment was underway. But the kingdom still did not name the site. States do not speak like that when the danger stayed comfortably far away. And once the location sharpened into Saudi Arabia's oil-rich eastern province, the headlines stopped sounding defensive and started sounding historical. This was not just a missile night. This was the moment millions of viewers realized the war may have just reached the energy belt that keeps the Gulf stable and the global market breathing. If you're here for the version that goes past the official wording and into what the wording is trying to protect, subscribe now and drop one comment before this ends. If Riyadh truly had nothing serious to hide, why is the exact facility still unnamed? What people clicked for is simple, and it deserves a straight answer fast. They clicked because Saudi downs 7 ballistic missiles sounds like control. But debris falls near eastern energy sites sounds like control breaking in real time. The title does not promise a clean victory. It promises a successful interception that still feels like something already went wrong. That feeling is the story, because the real fear was never just that missiles were launched at Saudi Arabia. The real fear was that even when the kingdom wins in the air, the war can still force its way close enough to energy infrastructure that the government has to admit proximity and then immediately retreat into silence. That is why this is not a normal interception story. A normal interception story ends with reassurance. This one ended with damage assessment, strategic vagueness, and an unnamed site in the east. The difference between those two endings is exactly why the audience clicked. And the most important thing to understand is this. In modern energy warfare, you do not always need to hit the site to hit the system. Sometimes getting close enough is the message. Sometimes forcing the defender to reveal that something sensitive was almost touched is already a form of strategic damage. That is the deeper layer beneath the title. The Saudi military may have destroyed 7 ballistic missiles, but the attack still managed to prove something. It proved that Eastern Saudi energy infrastructure can now be dragged into the public language of the war. And once that happens, the war is no longer just flying over the kingdom. It is pressing against what matters most. And the 7-missile headline was only the sharpest cut from a much larger defensive night. Saudi reporting later widened the picture to 11 ballistic missiles intercepted toward the eastern province, along with 18 drones destroyed over the same period. That means the kingdom was not dealing with one dramatic near miss. It was dealing with a sustained pressure event designed to test how much the East could absorb at once. That matters because repetition changes the meaning of defense. One intercepted missile can be sold as routine competence. Multiple ballistic missiles plus drones in the same operating window start to look less like a single attack and more like a systems test, one aimed not only at air defenses, but at readiness, endurance, public calm, and state credibility. This is where viewers can get trapped by the safest possible interpretation. The safe interpretation says Saudi defenses worked, the state stayed in control, and therefore the event was contained. But containment is not the same as safety, and it is definitely not the same as immunity. A state can contain a missile wave and still emerge from it more exposed than it was the night before. That is because interception solves one problem and creates another. It stops the warhead, but it does not stop gravity. It destroys the incoming missile, but it does not decide where every fragment falls. And when those fragments come down in the energy belt of the kingdom, what survives on the ground is no longer only debris. It is signal. That phrase in the vicinity is doing enormous work here. It does not mean harmless. It does not mean distant. It means close enough that officials chose distance as the safest word they could use. The moment the government has to describe an attack in relation to energy facilities instead of empty land, the battlefield has already shifted. And that battlefield shift is what makes the title so dangerous. Eastern Saudi Arabia is not a random compass direction. It is a concentration of energy assets, industrial infrastructure, and strategic symbolism so dense that almost any serious military pressure there becomes more than local. It becomes regional immediately and global if the pressure keeps building. That is also why the unnamed facility matters more than some viewers first realize. If the location were insignificant, naming it would calm people. If the risk were minor, naming it would reassure markets. Silence only becomes useful when naming the site could create more alarm than the government wants to trigger. So the first real question of the script is not who won the air defense exchange. The first real question is this: what kind of site gets close enough to falling missile debris that the state publicly acknowledges the category but still conceals the identity? Once you ask that, you are no longer watching a headline. You are reading a redaction. And that redaction is where the audience's instinct was exactly right. People clicked because they sensed the title was hiding a larger truth. They were right to sense that, because what made the title clickable was never just the number 7. It was the collision between a tactical success and a strategic admission in the same line. And there's another detail that makes the night feel even less contained. Before the 7 missile statement, Saudi defense reporting had already acknowledged the interception and destruction of the POR, ballistic missiles over the eastern province. So this did not arrive as one clean event with one clean narrative. It arrived in layers. And layered attacks are how pressure replaces spectacle. Pressure is harder to package than destruction. A direct hit gives you a crater, a fireball, a casualty number, a simple headline. Pressure gives you waves, alarms, ambiguity, partial information, and a defender forced to keep proving that the system still holds. For an attacker trying to create strategic unease, pressure can be enough. That is why the click reason behind this title was not shallow at all. The audience came because they wanted to know whether Saudi energy infrastructure was almost hit, whether this was just a warning shot, or whether the kingdom had already crossed into a more dangerous phase of the war without saying so directly. Those are the correct questions, and the answer is harder than either comfort story. If you say this was merely debris, you ignore how close the state says it fell to energy facilities. If you say this was a catastrophic hit, you run ahead of the confirmed facts. The truth lives in the middle, and the middle is exactly what makes it frightening. Not clean destruction, not clean safety, but a shrinking zone between them. That shrinking zone is where workers in the East now live. The operators, drivers, guards, maintenance teams, and families beneath that sky do not experience this as a debate between headlines. They experience it as the moment intercepted stopped sounding like safe. For them, the difference between a successful defense and a dangerous night is no longer measured in outcomes. It is measured in meters. And this is where the story stops looking isolated. Earlier in the war, Iran's Revolutionary Guards had already issued evacuation warnings naming Saudi Arabia's Samref refinery and Jubail petrochemical complex, alongside major energy sites in the UAE and Qatar. Once specific Gulf energy assets are publicly named in threat messaging, later ballistic pressure near Saudi energy facilities starts looking less like accident and more like pattern. That pattern matters because it kills the lazy reading. You can no longer treat this event as one random night of missiles in a crowded war. The infrastructure had already been placed inside the war's rhetorical target map. So when debris later falls near energy facilities in the kingdom's east, it arrives on top of a previous warning architecture. This is what mainstream breaking coverage often strips away. Sequence. Sequence tells you whether a missile event is noise or design. And the sequence here is ugly. The first named energy threats across the Gulf, then wider strikes on Gulf energy systems during the war. Then Saudi Arabia publicly admitting fresh ballistic debris near energy facilities in its own east. That is not noise. That is escalation logic. The kingdom knows this, which is why its wording matters so much. It acknowledged enough to remain credible. It withheld enough to deny targeting feedback, that is intelligent state behavior, but is also a clue. Governments do not become this careful around trivial incidents. And once you understand that, the title starts delivering exactly what the audience came for. Not a lecture about missiles, but a live strategic warning. The warning is that the war has moved from abstract, regional escalation into a phase where energy infrastructure itself is part of the coercive language. There's another layer under the surface that makes this event even more serious. Since the war began, Arab Gulf states have already used hundreds of missile interceptors to counter Iranian missiles and pull one-way attack UAVs. That means every successful defense is also a burn rate. The shield may be holding, but it is holding by consuming inventory, time, and margin every time the sky lights up. That changes how the Saudi night should be understood. It was not only a test of whether the kingdom could stop missiles, it was a test of how often it can keep stopping them, how much it can spend to do it, and how much proximity to strategic infrastructure the system can tolerate before public reassurance starts sounding thin. In other words, air defense here is not just protection, it is endurance. And endurance can be attacked without actually breaching the target. If enough ballistic pressure keeps arriving, the defender pays in interceptors, readiness, secrecy, and public confidence long before a decisive strike ever lands. That is what makes the story bigger than one night. It is not about whether Saudi Arabia is defenseless. It clearly is not. It is about whether a capable defender can still be strategically cornered into admitting that the war now reaches close to its energy heartland. That is where the phrase debris falls near eastern energy sites becomes more than dramatic wording. It becomes a description of a new reality, one where tactical success no longer guarantees strategic comfort, one where every interception now comes with a second payload, the question of where the fragments came down and what that proximity means. And the region had already seen why that question matters. Iranian strikes and intercepted fragments were assessed as having damaged several Gulf energy facilities on April 3rd. That means the Saudi event is not unfolding in a vacuum. The Gulf has already entered a reality where even fragments from defended attacks can still produce meaningful infrastructure consequences. That point is brutal because it removes the last comfortable escape route for the viewer. You can no longer say, well, if the missile was intercepted, then the energy system was never really in danger. That argument has already been weakened by the wider regional pattern. Intercepted fragments are now part of the threat environment too. And once fragments themselves carry strategic meaning, the definition of a successful defense changes. It is no longer enough to destroy the missile in the air. The defender must also avoid a politically dangerous proximity, physically damaging fallout, and the perception that its most important infrastructure is now living under repeatable ballistic pressure. That is the larger reason the audience clicked. They were not only asking whether Saudi Arabia got hit, they were asking whether the kingdom's eastern energy belt is now inside a new kind of war, one where the line between near hit and hit is less important than the fact that both now belong to the same operating logic. This is where the story shifts from event to implication. If eastern Saudi infrastructure can be placed under this kind of repeated pressure, then every future wave matters more than the last one. Not because the first wave failed, but because it taught everyone exactly how much fear a defended attack can still generate. And all of this rests on a larger capability backdrop that was already worrying analysts before this latest barrage. Iranian missile development has long raised the possibility of hitting targets deep inside Saudi Arabia, including Riyadh and missile defense sites. So the fear in this title does not depend on imagination alone. It sits on top of an already established strategic concern about reach. Capability changes everything, even before it fully translates into destruction. Once a state knows the other side can credibly threaten depth, every interception becomes proof of danger. Not proof that the danger was exaggerated. That is why this event lands so hard. It activates a fear structure that was already present. This is also why Saudi Arabia's careful silence about the exact site is so revealing. It is not only about one night. It is about preventing the public, the market, and the adversary from understanding exactly how close the war got to a place whose symbolic value may exceed its visible damage. That is where the information war lives. Saudi Arabia gains by admitting enough to avoid looking dishonest, while withholding enough to avoid giving away vulnerability. If Iran was behind the barrage, it gains, even if the site was not directly hit. Because forcing Saudi Arabia into that posture already creates unease. One side protects ambiguity, the other side profits from it. And that is why the safest summary of this event is also the weakest one. The weak summary says missiles were intercepted and the situation remains under assessment. The stronger truth is that a state with serious air defenses still had to publicly acknowledge ballistic debris near energy facilities in its east while refusing to say exactly where. That is not routine. That is stress. There is one more brutal possibility running through this story. Escalate to de-escalate strategies rarely work. If the logic behind putting Gulf infrastructure under pressure is to frighten Gulf states into restraining Washington and more, Israel, the strategy can backfire by convincing those same states that neutrality no longer protects them. That would make this event dangerous in two directions at once. Dangerous for Saudi Arabia because it reveals Eastern energy exposure. Dangerous for Iran if Iran was behind it, because repeated pressure on Gulf neighbors can slowly transform fearful hedging into harder alignment against Tehran. But even if that backfire eventually happens, Saudi Arabia still has to survive the road to it. It still has to defend the East, preserve confidence, protect strategic infrastructure, and avoid showing its adversaries exactly where the pressure bites deepest. That is a much harder task than the headline "shot down 7 missiles" suggests. And that is why this story keeps widening the deeper you go. First, it is a military event. Then it becomes an infrastructure event. Then an endurance event. Then an information war event. Then a coalition-shaping event. By the time you reach the end, you are no longer asking only what happened. You are asking what kind of war this has become. So here is the central question answered cleanly. Was this a failed strike on Saudi energy infrastructure, or a successful warning that Saudi energy infrastructure can now be held under ballistic pressure whenever the war needs a new lever? The answer is yes to both, and that is precisely why the title works so hard. If the missiles were meant to hit Saudi energy infrastructure directly, then the kingdom's defenses likely prevented a much larger escalation point. But the public admission about debris near energy facilities proves how narrow the margin was. If the missiles were meant primarily as coercive signaling, then the signaling still landed, because Riyadh had to admit proximity to sensitive energy infrastructure and keep the exact location vague. That dual truth is the real intelligence inside the story. Failed strike, successful warning. Tactical loss for the attacker, strategic discomfort for the defender. The warhead did not need to land cleanly for the message to land hard. And once that message lands, the old comfort dies. The comfort that Saudi Arabia's energy east sits safely outside the war. The comfort that interception equals closure. The comfort that unnamed means unimportant. All of those assumptions leave this story weaker than they entered it. So the final conclusion should stick in the viewer's gut long after the video ends. Saudi Arabia may have destroyed 7 ballistic missiles, but the larger event proved that the war can now push close enough to the kingdom's energy heartland to force a public admission and a strategic silence in the same breath. That is not a clean victory. That is a warning. And once energy infrastructure becomes part of the language through which war now speaks, every future interception carries 2 payloads, the missile in the sky and the fear on the ground that next time in the sky vicinity may become something no government can afford to leave unnamed. Stay locked in here, because this channel follows the signal after everyone else stops at the headline.